Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Daily Friend Show, the live edition. Well, if you're watching on YouTube live, if you're listening on the audio, not quite live, but close enough, I suppose. Today I'm joined by Makone Maja. Makone, how are you doing this warm spring day?
Having a lovely Friday. Thanks. I'm happy to be here with you both.
This is a good thing. We are approaching the best time of the week, those hours at the end of Friday when work is done and the weekend has not even yet begun. We're also joined today by Ricardo Teixeira. Ricardo, how are you doing?
I am alive. I'm doing well. The weather is beautiful and I have no reason to complain.
Well, I recently had a big fire near my house because I'm now in the Cape, as happens from time to time in the Cape. And as a result, the air is rather unpleasant still, but regardless, we shall soldier on. So what have we got on the plate today to chat about? We've got some discussions about the Madlanga Commission and sort of where we think this is all going. We're going to talk about South Africa's new export strategy, supposedly, which someone has cleverly named the butterfly strategy. So we'll get into that. And last, we're going to talk about Ricardo's favorite topic, which is the SANDF, its many shortcomings and what we should be doing instead. So let's start with our first one. This comes from an opinion piece written by Professor William Gumede, and it is titled, "The Madlanga Commission is likely to hasten the ANC's demise." Now, with various bits of polling and by-election results and things, the topic of the ANC's electoral collapse has been sort of looming in the background of so many of our political discussions. In fact, while we obviously don't know what the results in the next local government election are going to be, the early signs are that the ANC is in big trouble. So drawing on this, let me read some extracts from Professor Gumede's piece here. He says, "The Madlanga Commission is likely to have a much more substantial impact on the country's political landscape than all other commissions held since the end of apartheid. It is likely to bring down ANC leaders because cause the party's support to plunge to 20% in the next year's local government elections and potentially lead to the early exit of Cyril Ramaphosa as ANC and South African president. Though the Zondo Commission was widely seen as an inquiry into the ANC, with Ramaphosa admitting the party stood accused of corruption, it is in fact the Madlanga Commission that will uncover the truth about the liberation behemoth. The ANC's control of the police through its deployment of police ministers that serve the party's interests rather than those of the public, as well as its past appointments of national police commissioners who were cadres rather than professional police officers, allowed the party to control investigations into its senior ranks. Past inquiries, such as the Zondo Commission, were established so that government would be seen to be doing something about graft, and had little impact on the ANC and its leaders, even if they were implicated in wrongdoing. The difference between the Madlanga Commission and the others that have preceded it is that for the first time, a senior government official, KZN Provincial Police Commissioner Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, played a critical role in pushing for the inquiry, has evidence in his possession, and is willing to make that information public. The information that will come out of the Madlanga Commission is likely to pit ANC leaders and factions against each other, as well as to widen factional divisions in the party, and may even determine who becomes the ANC president after Ramaphosa. Makone, what do you make of that argument? I think I'm pretty much on board with the narrative that the ANC is sort of falling apart. What I am less sold on is exactly sort of how that happens. The ANC is going to continue to be the largest party in parliament until 2029, and I think there's very little chance of a early election before that for national government. So regardless of how badly the ANC does in the local government elections, they're still going to be the most important player in our parliament until 2029. Do you think the Madlanga Commission is going to have as big an impact as Gumede says? And what do you think about the ANC's continuing importance in Parliament, even if their popular support has dropped?
I will say firstly that I haven't been a big fan of these commissions. I think they've only been a very efficient way of postponing and delaying actual justice. And look no further than the Zondo Commission for this. Hundreds of millions of government taxpayer money went towards taking a fine-tooth comb, which Judge Zondo and the lead examiners did, and uncovering the levels of corruption that had permeated throughout our state institutions. And there have been recoveries, for asset forfeitures, recoveries, to pay back some of the money that was looted. But ultimately, how I would measure success of a commission would be a commission such as Madlanga or Zondo, where corruption is being investigated, or capture of the state is being investigated, would be prosecutions, but particularly of high profile and high ranking public representatives and politicians that we just haven't seen those. In fact, what you've seen, which Judge Zondo lamented as well, is that some of the most infamously accused individuals from the Zondo Commission were sworn in as members of parliament, sworn in to defend and protect the constitution, to exercise oversight. I haven't been a fan of these commissions for that reason. I think it was another incident in which the president tried to save the ANC at South Africa's expense and is now losing both. So I have to agree with Professor Gumede there that I do think that while there may be little impact as far as prosecutions go, the political consequences are grave. I have been very worried about observing as the memory of the testimony that came out of the Zondo Commission be wiped out of public memory, be denied. Many of MK leaders who are implicated in the Zondo Commission, they've come out and just outright denied, the allegations that they were accused of, have accused the commission of having ulterior motives. And you sort of see their supporters buying into that, that populist rhetoric. And that was my concern with this commission as well, is how much of it will people recall when it's time to make important decisions at the ballot box. I think differently from the Zondo Commission is that we have the social media, and that's what's likely keeping the memory of the Madlanga Commission, and the public conversation has been brought into the fold and has been given sort of a microphone, because you can actually see in real time what people think. And what I've also observed is staunch ANC supporters who defended the ANC by hook or by crook, no matter what allegations were leveled against them, because they were just, waiting in bated breath for their turn to be in government. They're seeing as the carpet is basically running out, right? Because the ANC won't be a majority party. They aren't now, but that majority, that share of their power in government is already diminishing. They can see that the ANC is running out of rope, running out of road, and they themselves are starting to become critical of the party, but aided by the exposure and the just the explosive nature of the allegations being made at the Madlanga Commission, how deeply connected ANC cadres are to the story of that capture. So I do see there has been yes, there has already been a decline in the ANC that we've observed over the years, but I do think that the Madlanga Commission has hastened it. It may not assist with prosecutions necessarily, but as far as having political consequences, I definitely see that has already been taking place.
Ricardo, your thoughts? Do you agree?
I agree. I like what Makone said there about, we've had a lot of these commissions before. And what Judge Zondo said, he was asked about, didn't it hurt him having to swear these people into parliament with all their findings? And in particular, I always think of now Deputy Minister of Water and Sanitation, David Mashlobo, who at the Zondo Commission was pointed out as one of the people that hollowed out our intelligence agencies, and he led there were several allegations about people bringing briefcases and duffel bags filled with cash and weapons to his personal home under official instruction from the agency. And we still don't know where any of that went. We still don't know what happened there. And we saw how the State Security Agency was repositioned under Zuma to protect him and the ANC. But we never thought, well, hasn't that happened with the police as well? And I think we are starting to see that with the Madlanga Commission, to see how ingrained ANC corruption is within the police, and that there's not there's no such thing as a unified force within the ANC and even within the state branches, that the factionalism of the ANC extends to factionalism within the police. And that's not something we want, and that's not something we need.
Yeah, so I must say I am a little bit more fond of these commissions than I think either of you are. Not because they've resulted in any real justice. They obviously have not. But what they've done is they've, when you kind of have looked into the details of these of what's been going on, the corruption, the disorganization, the incompetence, all these things, when you actually begin to examine the details and hear the story of precisely what happened, they sort of begin to build the larger case for what exactly is wrong. And I think the Zondo Commission report was very useful in that sphere, is that it pointed out, for example, the problems in procurement with BEE. And so, the commission hasn't sent anyone who really needs to go to jail yet. It started to build this sort of, it's changed the ideas and political landscape in a way that I think there's a direct link between that commission actually and the ANC's declining fortunes. The ANC doesn't really have an intellectually feasible argument to defend its position anymore. It's stuck in this position where it has to retreat to its good old, oh, well, you're all just saying that because you're all agents of apartheid or something, which every single time they say it becomes a less and less credible accusation to be thrown around. And that we've sort of steadily seen this credibility degrading. You go back to the ANC in the 90s and the 2000s, the ANC had a lot of credibility. People took it very seriously when it said things. When, President Mbeki said we're going to look into this or what, there would be cynics who would say, well, you're just going to mess around or whatever. But there was still, I think, amongst most South Africans, this kind of idea that, well, no, you see, the ANC, even if it has some flaws, is ultimately on the right path. And what the Zondo Commission and these other ones have exposed is that that's just not true, that the rot is deep and it's to all the highest levels. And that sort of has downstream effects. By the time it gets to electioneering, people they may not remember all the details of what happened in the Madlanga Commission or what happened in the Zondo Commission. They may not even have watched these things, but they know the vibe. And so, not to get all vibology here, Makone, but I think it's created a bit of a vibe shift in the South African populace. I don't know. Do you agree with me? What's your take on that?
I disagree insofar as I think that the Madlanga Commission is doing Parliament's job. And if Parliament had succeeded at actually exercising oversight, you wouldn't need these commissions, the state capture of Zondo and the one of Madlanga. There's a book called Permitted Plundering by, I may be getting the lady's name wrong, it's Ilsa Salzwedel, I think. It was, sponsored by CAS, and I think they partnered with OUTA, the Organization Undoing Tax Abuse. And in that book, she goes through all the instances and Parliament had the opportunity to, take a peek into what's really happening behind a lot of the discrepancies, the financial discrepancies, the malfeasance, the irregular appointments, super shady and dodgy appointments that were being made at the time. And they absolutely did nothing. And you're seeing that as well with how this Madlanga Commission came about. It's that Nkwanazi didn't first go to the media on July 6th to make that statement before all of us. He tried to go through the proper channels, one of which was Parliament. And there was surface level investigation done or questioning done by Parliament then. And now they're playing catch up. If you are watching these portfolio committee meetings where, the Minister of Police and Chunya has appeared before them, the Deputy National Police Commissioner, Sibi, has now appeared before them, they're playing catch up as the Madlanga Commission proceeds with doing a job that they were supposed to do. And this need not be and wouldn't have been the case if Parliament had actually been on top of exercising, again, accountable, holding those individuals accountable, holding the police accountable, particularly the police, because it's such a critical institution in a democratic nation. So I do appreciate a lot of the investigation and how thorough the commissions are. You're even seeing it now with the level of questioning that's happening in Parliament against that's happening in the Madlanga Commission. I mean, Parliament's literally a drop in the ocean of the work that the Madlanga's doing. And there was an argument in Parliament about whether the witnesses should be using the bundles that they already submitted to the Madlanga Commission, basically copying and pasting them to submit them to Parliament. I mean, why would they need to duplicate those statements, particularly because the Madlanga is so meticulous, very specific in their questioning. They really drill deeper into the issues in a way that Parliament simply does not. And that's why you're seeing them now play catch up as they try to go alongside the Madlanga Commission and even outcompete them in obtaining those testimonies from witnesses. So no, I still stand by us not needing these commissions, but for the fact that Parliament's not doing its job.
I think you're really highlighting there a point that I like to make all the time, which is that Parliament really is the center of our democracy, and it has been turned because of, our Parliament is essentially designed to work as a very divided body where sort of consensus is generated on broad fronts, and our proportional representative system, very much feeds into that. When you look at countries with similar parliamentary systems, like in the Netherlands or Germany or whatever, no one holds a majority. So, parliaments are more effective because they're actually able to sort of interrogate things, because you have committees made up of people across party lines, not just dominance by one party. And unfortunately, that has not been the case in our parliament. As you correctly point out, it has just been turned into this absolute rubber stamp. I think that is starting to change now. Not nearly fast enough, but it is sort of slowly moving in that direction as the ANC has lost its majority in Parliament. But you're right, it still hasn't been used to the proper degree yet, which is a problem. And then we're forced to have these sort of commissions which don't have real power often and drag on forever, whereas Parliament might be a little bit more efficient. Even then, we still do sometimes get some good stuff out of Parliament. I mean, there are sometimes some good questions and stuff answered. So it's not a completely useless institution, but it really has not been used to the fullest potential that it should be used. Ricardo, any final thoughts on this one before we move on?
I agree with you and Makone about Parliament not doing its job. And we've even seen Ian Cameron, the Portfolio Committee on Police chairperson, say that they failed to do their job. Even though some of the questions being asked at the Madlanga Commission were questions they asked early in the year, like who is Brown Makotsi and what's going on with the political killing stars team. They were asking these questions back in February and January, but they didn't get anywhere with them. And I feel like that is also partially the result of Parliament just having a lot to do. And I think that the level of detail coming out of the Madlanga Commission and the parliamentary committee is that there's so much coming out. Like you said, it is hard for anyone to really keep track of what exactly happened, but you kind of get the gist of, this is just a lot of corruption and it all went wrong. But even if we look at, I love his videos, that Dan Corder, where he does like a weekly video lately updating on the Madlanga Commission. And he had to do 2 videos in one day because as soon as he was done with one, more stuff came out. And they had to then, we've got to do something on this. And it's just been something that's happened that is very refreshing, is to see how quickly things have been moving. Something came out of the Madlanga Commission. The next day, Shadrack Sibiya's house gets raided. Senzo Mshunu's house gets raided. And it's that level of speed is actually quite refreshing for once. But I think there's just so much happening. It's so hard to keep track that, as you said, Nick, it's just going to have to be a vibe check, because to try and sit there in the ballot box and recall details, it's going to take hours.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move on to our next story. Now, one of South Africa's biggest trading partners until recently was the United States. China as a country was our single biggest trading partner, and the United States was usually somewhere between 3rd place and 1st place, depending on the year, in terms of trading partners. With the European Union, if you take all of the countries that are part of it as a whole, being our largest trading partner. Well, with the tariff situation with the US and the fact that it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, despite many promises from government that South Africa would be able to strike a trade deal with the United States to avoid most of these tariffs, government is now starting to talk about maybe diversifying export markets. Deputy Minister of Trade, Industry and Competition, Zuko Godlimpi, has unveiled a new export diversification approach, which someone has cleverly named the butterfly strategy. And this is the idea that, like a butterfly that pollinates multiple flowers, South Africa must establish trade flows across every continent. Our economic resilience depends on our ability to diversify, to connect, and to adapt. The government in this policy says that the African Free Trade Area, which is this thing that was established, but by the AU, African Union, but exists far more on paper than it does in reality, which is supposed to create a big free trade zone in Africa. That should be the focus of government efforts, but then also we must stretch out to our BRICS partners like Brazil, India, China, Saudi Arabia, because they all have these sort of vast consumer bases. Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand, young, dynamic, and rapidly industrializing, should also all be included. South Africa should not sell so many raw materials unless it's agricultural goods, because, I don't know, agricultural goods are somehow the good raw materials or something, and we must set up more industries and sell more valuable products than we currently do. And there's lots of talk here about we must pursue this with intelligent coordination, persistence, nimble exporters, government support through trade missions and market intelligence, financial institutions, understanding export finance, and a whole of nation approach where business, labor, and government work together in concert. How lovely. Here's the problem. The reason we are having difficulty selling to new markets and competing in the world economy is because through various regulations, through crime, through infrastructure problems, through all the things we talk about every day on this show, our economy is not particularly worth investing in, and that's why we can't compete in these global markets. You can't just magic up mineral beneficiations. The reason we sell the raw materials, which is because to turn them into something more useful here isn't competitive for everything from labor laws to BEE to bad infrastructure. Makone, am I being the Grinch here, or is this just ridiculous?
Yeah, Nick, I think less poetry, more strategy, because I hear a lot about, a lot of really nice words about how South Africa needs to diversify, but it's not clear to me that there's an actual strategy behind this. And you're right. I think there's a pipeline dream, and we tend to put on these rose-tinted glasses when you imagine a vision for this united Africa where you can trade across country lines like they do in the EU, but we still don't have a lot of the logistical basics rights. If you've ever tried to...
There's a lot of African states that don't even really fully control their own territory. Like, how are you supposed to move across Eastern DRC with your truck when it's just going to be attacked by rebels or bandits, for example?
Exactly. If you've ever tried to do anything out beyond the war zones to import anything from one of these countries, sometimes you find, as I have, that the delivery costs, the shipping alone, like DHL, costs more than the thing you're actually buying. So there's a lot of infrastructure that needs to go into place before we can even envision, fulfilling this Africa Free Continental Trade Agreement. But I also think getting the continental basics right, you're absolutely correct to point out that our own domestic basics are also out of sorts. How is South Africa going to outcompete countries when we're concerned with things like, a very high national minimum wage, logistics that also do not work? I'm speaking here about the structural challenges South Africa have in electricity and in rail and road transport. I'm thinking here about BEE and the fact that our race-based legislation does not exactly incentivize investment. You spoke earlier in the show about investors, South African companies sitting on a 1.8 trillion rand cash pile rather than using it to develop the country, to invest in the country, that tells you that those investor confidence numbers that we often reflect on, I think the last one that was done by RMB and BER showed that about 6 out of 10 of the companies in South Africa are dissatisfied with the business environment, with the operating environment. Those numbers when you start to see that it actually translates into companies withholding their cash rather than using it to drive development, that relationship does exist, and it's solidified by those sort of statistics, that to imagine that we'll somehow be able to attract investors outside of South Africa to come here and see it as an investment destination. We're getting ahead of ourselves. We're trying to run before we can even walk. And so I think a lot of the work has to be done first here at home to enable those reforms that will first make sure that South Africa can be investable. That way we can produce more. And only then can you start thinking about diversifying those goods and services that you are now able to produce to outcompete your emerging market counterparts and spreading your wings like a butterfly, I'm afraid. Sorry, I said that.
I think that's 100% right, Ricardo. If the reason why these tariffs from the US are such a disaster for our economy was because our economy is not in a good place. If our economy was like this strong envy of the world with an incredibly powerful mining sector and producer of all these critical minerals that we sit on, and was making all sorts of goods and providing interesting services and stuff like that across the world, the Americans tariff us and we say, okay, well, it's fine, we'll just sell to other markets. But we don't have a lot of options right now, precisely because of our general economic weakness. Your take?
Yeah, as you say, we don't really have much to offer. I mean, I was recently asked by a friend who's an attaché about how defense exports could fit into this butterfly strategy. And that is, I told him that's a question he should ask the president, because, we don't have much to offer on the international stage, but we want to offer products. But we have a defense industry that survives on 92% solely on exports. Most of what we make for the defense industry is purely exported, and it's mostly to some of these markets. But it's not being invested in by government. It's not being supported by government. And if the government is looking for anywhere, a time and a place, really, to start punting its defense industry and selling it, now is very much the time. And the world is very much the place right now. And with this strategy, we've been looking at some of those countries. We've had a lot of defense deals with Malaysia. Malaysia's been a big buyer of Denel's Ingwe anti-tank missiles. In fact, the turrets that were designed for our Badger infantry fighting vehicles are only in service because we exported them to Malaysia, and it helped that project turn a bit of a profit, which kept it going for a while. But then we've had other deals with, like the Makone missiles, which are surface-to-air missiles that we manufacture, which are in service with Finland, and Finland's very happy with them. We've got a lot of these products, but the government just doesn't seem interested. And it is an opportunity under this where the government could really corner a part of the international arms market at a time where arms spending is at its highest in history. But it just seems that, like this plan, there's not much thought given to it.
Right, exactly. You can do all the industrial development plans you like in the world and talk about nimble this and intelligent that, but if you don't get the basics right, it's just all kind of corporate buzz speak for something that isn't going to materialize in benefit to actual South Africans. Okay.
One line that really made stuck out to me was understanding export finance. That seems to imply that we still do not understand export finance.
Yeah, I get the feeling that our banks and finance sector, which is one of the strongest parts of our economy, actually probably do understand it and have decided that it's just not worth touching too much.
Yeah, man, it is. Leaves me with a headache.
So, our last topic, Ricardo, this is your bread and butter, your delight in your life. You wrote a piece a little while ago, but relatively recently, talking about how the South African National Defence Force has outdated doctrine, and we're facing a very different world from the one which our doctrine was written about. Can you tell us a little bit about, why does this matter? Why should we be thinking about our Army's doctrine? That doesn't seem very important right now.
It's emblematic of a larger problem in that like the police and any other government department. It was kind of inherited and then driven forward with an ideological wedge, but at no point was any thought put towards, well, does what we've inherited and taken forward, is it still going to be relevant? Like our policing as well is like this. If you read the book by Zianda Stirman, I've got it here, Can We Be Safe? She talks about how not much changed with our police post 1994 in terms of its doctrine, how it operated. It is still very much a Skop and Donner police force, but it's clearly not helping to us solve our crimes. And it's the same with the Defence Force, where its tactics, its operational procedures are still built around lessons for the border war. But we aren't planning on going to war with Angola anytime soon. And seeing how in 28 years in the DRC, they haven't been able to translate any of the border war doctrine into battlefield successes in the DRC, it's time to go back to the drawing board. And why this is particularly timely is we're seeing the Chief of the Army. In fact, today is his golf day down in Oudtshoorn, and he's famous for them. But they've just concluded their Army Command Council Cadre Conference, the extended Army Command Cadre Council Conference. And they're gearing up for their annual exercise Vukuslome, which is going to be in Lahatla, where my background was taken. This is last year's iteration of it. But what I observed last year and what I've observed in the lead up to this year's one is that it's nothing new. It's all the same. In fact, it's the same vehicles. It's the same displays. I look at pictures that were taken in 2021, 2022, 2023, and 2024. And if I'm not careful, I can't differentiate between which year they were taken because it's literally the same old thing. And our government needs to move forward, firstly, but the world has moved on past South Africa. And if we think we're going to be able to survive any sort of modern day threat, we're going to need to first take a look at those threats and understand them. And one of the big things that you see them doing at the moment is this thing called the modern brigades, which involves 45-year-old equipment, riflemen with an average age of 39, and tactics defined in the 1940s and refined in the 1970s and 80s. At no point is anything such as the drone in use. Digital communication, battlefield command and control, none of it is there. And it's all just a small little... we can't really say that it's as impressive as a Chinese military parade. You know, they fire off a couple artillery shells like these that were manufactured in 1994, and they've never placed an order since. But this happens to be the only time they fire them off because it looks impressive. But it's just like everything else in the government. It needs a complete refresh.
Yeah, Makone, we were talking about this a little bit before the show, and we're sort of struck by the repetitiveness, and sometimes it drives me mad on the show doing this every weekday. How so many of our institutions, you can tell almost exactly the same story about them. You have bad policy mixed with political appointments, and the consequence of that has rotted the entire institution kind of from top to bottom. And the fact that the SANDF is still just kind of running on the fumes of the 70s and 80s, speaks to that kind of rot. What's your take on all this?
My sense is that a country's army is reflective of its government ethos. And what Ricardo seems to be describing there, which I am not very familiar with, but it sounds that as though the SANDF is still caught in like days 40 years ago, 50 years ago, that it's failed to innovate, to demand and to respond to the demands of the present. And I think you see that a lot in how the ANC operates. And unfortunately, the ANC has been the single defining entity in South African government and South African politics. So it comes as no surprise to me to learn that, the way that we operate at the army level, which should be the highest level for any democratic country, carries throughout, government operations. One of the most succinct line I found in the article is where you say that the gap between what the SANDF is mandated to do and what it is equipped to do keeps widening, and that soon it will become impossible to bridge that divide. And you see this permeating throughout the government, is where they have these stated goals and these stated outcomes, and then you look at the implementation and they couldn't be further apart. So yeah, I can see how the relics of the SANDF are mimicked throughout our own government.
Yeah, what comes to mind is always the way that we have all these constitutional guarantees about how our citizens are supposed to be able to live, access to water, access to housing, that kind of thing, and government has got all these powers to fulfill those needs, but because of its lack of capacity, because of that rot, you basically get these things taken to court, and the courts are forced to basically say that the government can kind of almost ignore these constitutional imperatives, because they say, well, they apparently don't have capacity to provide you with housing, so tough luck. And it cheapens everything, right? It cheapens what these institutions are supposed to do. It stretches government too thin, and it dilutes the constitution in those cases, right, where you have constitutional rights that are not guaranteed. So I think, once again, if there's a theme to this episode, it's that we need to do basics right. You need to have the very basic performance of your police, of your army, of your government working at a high level, and then you can be a little bit more ambitious with what you actually want to do. If you don't have that foundation, you're just going to get this incredible rot. And due to decisions made and due to the policy of cadre deployment, we have seen incredible rot in our institutions, and that needs to urgently be undone. Okay, I think we've gone a little bit long, so thank you very much for watching. We hope you found the show interesting today. We will, of course, be back on Monday. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. We'll see you all next week. Cheers, everyone.